Before we start this video, a large thank you to Yahir, a name unfortunately cannot pronounce. Thank you for the support, my friend. Mira and Erich for their support on Patreon. I hope you guys enjoy the video. And an immense thank you to Halo Burner and Kino for their continued support of the channel this month on Patreon. It is greatly appreciated, gentlemen, and I hope you enjoy the video. Hello everybody, today we're going to continue with the range systems. The first thing we do is go to the override, take these animation layers I put here before, and bring them on down to the action override, because I redid this in Nephilim to actually hold the arrow, and I find A, it's neater down here, and B, it works a little bit nicer, it's a bit more concise. So we're going to move it from the base layer, this is just the ranged animation states again, those blend trees, down to the override layer. Next, bring over your draw and fire animations over here like so. Delete the transition from fire to empty because we're going to do it a little bit different. So we're going to go from draw to idle aiming, and we're going to make that have exit time. If you're using the animations from our store page, set the exit time to 1 and the transition duration to 0 because we don't need to blend at all. It blends in perfectly. Then we're going to go from idle aiming and aiming to fire if a condition is met. The condition is going to be, we're going to add a bool here for is holding an arrow. Or holding RB if you'd prefer. If you want to use that as a generic, up to you. I'm going to say is holding arrow. I like that more. So if the condition is holding arrow is false, instantaneously, no exit time, go to this fire animation. Do the same thing from idle aiming here. Again, if the condition is if you're not holding an arrow, instantaneously go to this condition here, to this new state. So I was setting up a Nephilim before where I tap RB and then tap and put a transition from fire to empty. I tap RB to load an arrow and tap RB to fire it, but after trying ELDENs, I like it more, so I changed it, and after revising Nephilims, I figured out a way to do it a little bit nicer here. So go to the Player Network Manager, and we're going to make a new bool for is holding arrow, not to be confused with is has arrow notched. This lets us know if we can draw a projectile or if we should already, and this one lets us know if we're just constantly holding one right now. Releasing RB will release the arrow. So both are required. I'm going to put the comments to the side because I don't really need them, but just if there's any confusion there, keep them. One is for checking when we load, and one is for basically if we're still holding on to them when we have loaded. All right, so we're going to make a new on is holding arrow changed, and all we're going to do is basically change that new animator bool we just made to the status of is holding arrow. Now let's also go ahead after we have this in here now and jump over on the player manager and on network spawn and on network despawn. You know how this goes now. So again, player manager script, make sure you put it outside of his owner because this should occur on everybody's game object. So for example, another player's game object in your game, you don't own it, but this needs to fire if he changes this network status. So player network manager is holding arrow on value changed plus equals player network manager on is holding arrow changed. Very cool. Go down here to network despawn, do the same thing, unsubscribe from the event. And lastly, for the weird edge case, where you might join as a guy already has an arrow being held, down here to on load other player character. It probably won't happen, but it can happen. So just do that too. And is holding arrow on is holding arrow changed, false, and then pass on is holding arrow, or sorry, is holding arrow status. So this makes it so if you join while someone already has an arrow loaded and held, you'll join with it and you'll see the arrow in their hand loaded and held. All right, now let's go to the player input manager. I think we already have a hold right bumper input if I recall. Yes, there it is. All right, cool. So let's find out where this goes. And this is gonna be a lot easier than Nephilim, I think, because we use this for holding spells, I do believe. Yes, we do. Cool. So all we gotta do is add right here, if hold RB, player.player network manager is holding arrow is equal to true. And if we're not holding RB, we set it to false. Very simple, very straightforward. All right, cool. Looks good. Now save that. Let's go over to the player combat manager. And now we're going to make some logic where we finally do our release projectile. So under my combo, I'm going to put it here, public void release arrow. Now, we have to do this one a bit differently than spells. I'll explain why at the end of the video. So first thing we're going to do is check for our warm-up effects and destroy that. That's cool. This is going to be an animation event, by the way, so this will be processed on your game object in your game and the game object in your friend's game that represents your player. So next we can play some sound effects. I'm just going to go to the World Sound Effect Manager and add 2 arrays, one for release and one for basically notching the arrows. So you don't need this. This is just a polish element, but I'm going to put it in here now because I already have it. I'm just going to yoink the sound effects I have from Nephilim. Again, lots of sound effects online, so many libraries, lots of free ones too, or you can make your own, which is always fun. So this is not really important. If you don't have any, don't worry about it. Just don't include it right now or make the array empty. So player.player character sound effect manager, play sound effect, and we're going to use our choose random sound effects from array, and then we're going to pass our release arrow sound effect. And while we're here too, I'm just going to copy this and we can go to where we have the draw projectile here. You can see this is a client RPC under the player network manager. And I'm also just going to play some draw sound effects or notch arrow sound effects. So I'll make a comment here, play sound effects. Then we can paste what we had over here and replace release arrow with draw. I'm going very fast, guys, so pause if you need to, but there's a lot to cover in this one, so I'm trying to make it so the video is not over 40 minutes if I can. Let's go down here now and drag in your sound effects, if you have them, into World Sound Effect Manager. Now, you're going to get an error if you load no weapon in your character. I just noticed that. Why is that? Well, we're trying to load -1 on the weapon array, but it doesn't exist because obviously an array can't be -1 value. So what we're going to do is check basically if the value is greater than or equal to 0. Yes, load it from the weapons in right hand or left hand slots. Otherwise, we're going to load it directly from the world item database and load it as the unarmed weapon. Because we're doing that by default when you switch your network variable to -1, but when we're loading the game, we can't load a negative array value. It doesn't exist. So we're just going to simply manually ourselves get the unarmed item from the world item database. All right, cool. Just going to quickly do the left weapon as well. Make sure everything's in order, and then I'll quickly test that off camera to make sure it is gone away. And then we can go back to doing our projectile. So put this here, make sure I'm checking for the left weapon index first up top, and then get the left weapon from the world item database. All right, cool, save that. All right, all good, was working. Go to the fire arrow animation, add an animation event on the first frame, and whatever you've called it, release projectile, release arrow, put that there and apply. Let's jump back now to the release arrow function. I'm going to make a comment here for animating the bow. So it's the exact same way that we animated it when we do the fire projectile action. We're getting the bow in our left to right hand. If we're two-handing our left weapon, it has to be in our left hand. Otherwise, it has to be in our right hand. And then we're going to basically do the same thing, but instead of drawing it, we're going to make it fire. So if you want to, you can actually yoink the code from that place over there, which I am going to do right now, actually. So I'm going to copy. This is under notify server of drawn projectile, client RPC. Copy it all, and then come back over here, and then we're just going to paste it. Whoops, didn't mean to get rid of the local variable. Paste it like this. All right, cool. So instead of is drawn being true, it's going to be false, and we reference our is two-handing left weapon by saying player.player network manager. And instead of playing bow draw 01, I believe it's called bow fire, but I am going to check just to be sure. Yes, it is. Bow fire 01, copy that, back to the script, paste, good to go. All right, next come back to the fire projectile item and make sure you're setting has arrow notched to true right before you load the arrow. So right here where it says if the arrow is not notched, load the arrow, set the arrow notch to true. Save that, come back to the fire or release arrow functionality right here and say if you are the owner, because this is ran on an animation event and it's going to run on game object in your game and somebody else's game. If you are the owner, set arrow is notched to false. Cool, save that. Now I'm going to go in the game. I'm going to drag my scriptable into the variable of my main projectile here. And then I'm going to load the arrow and release it. Boom, there you go. And then boom. Now keep in mind, if the arrow count is being edited and you didn't clone the scriptable, it's going to affect the scriptable defaultly. So the arrow count by default will no longer be 30. Just keep that in mind if you're testing it like I am. All right, so we can walk, but we can't really walk in all directions, and if we roll, some weird stuff happens. So what are we going to do? Well, we gotta edit what we're allowed to do here when we enter this stance of aiming. So under the idle aiming two-handed weapon, make a new script. This is on the animation state, by the way. Toggle notched arrow movement, I'm going to call this, because we want to be able to move slowly, walk, and we want to be able to roll to cancel this. So let's drop in our namespace, and there is no start and update functionality here, which is kind of breaking tradition, but delete the comments here to on-state enter so we can actually write some code. And we're going to make a character manager or even a player manager variable if you want, because right now we're only doing this in the player, so that's fine as well. And this stuff really only applies to the player. We're going to say if player is equal null, player is equal to animator.getComponent player manager, and then if player is still equal to null, we're going to simply return because that should never be the case. So what do we want to do here? We want to allow our player to rotate, walk, and to roll. But also, under some circumstances, We want to lock the player back into a action where they can't do any of that. So make a bool for allow movement is defaultly set to true. And we're going to say player.player locomotion can move and can rotate is equal to allow movement. And then we're going to say is performing action is equal to the opposite of allow movement. Now, why are we doing that? Well, I'll explain in a moment. I'm sure you'll see actually. So we want to allow our movement and a rotation here. We want to say is performing action is equal to the opposite of allow movement. So why are we doing this? Well, let's save that. Let's go now under bow fire, add the same script untick allow movements. Basically, when you come back to firing the bow, it's going to temporarily lock you out of movement for a second. You can see here I can run. That's not desirable. So let's actually make it so we can't run too. Go to player locomotion manager. Let's make a new, actually go to character locomotion manager because in the future this one can apply to your AI if you wanted to. Let's make a flag for can run. And if this flag is not true, we're going to cut our movement speed in half to limit it out of walking. So under reset action flag, reset can run to true. Very important. That way, whenever your animation is done, your action is done, you can go back to running. And it'll handle it right here. So character locomotion can run is equal to true. Now, under onState enter for our toggle notched arrow movement, we're going to say can run is equal to the opposite of allow movement. Now let's save that and then go over to the player input manager. By the way, feel free to slow down and pause this so you can take a look at what they're doing exactly and why that makes sense. Under handle player input, right before we send the input values to the animator, what we want to do is check for can run. And if we cannot run, then we are going to change these values to half. So if move amount is greater than 0.5, we're going to say it's 0.5, or rather, yeah, cap it at half is a better way to say that, because it's not exactly cutting in half totally. We're just making sure we can't go above the walking threshold, which is 0.5. Do the same thing for your vertical input and then your horizontal input. So if they're above 0.5, cap them at 0.5 if you're unable to run. All right, let's save that now. That looks good. Now if I jump back in game, load the arrow, I can no longer sprint. Cool. Now, when I release the arrow, I'm locked into not moving again because I enter a state on this release where I can't. But if I roll, you can see this weird thing happens where the bow is still loaded and the arrow is floating. So let's go to the attempt to perform dodge. And all we're going to do is say player.player effects manager dot, and then we're going to say cancel current effects. Or I can't remember what it's called. It's the player network manager, actually. Yeah, cancel current effects. Is that what it was called? Destroy all current effects. Now, optionally too, you could put this on your play target action animation if you so desire, but just for simplicity's sake, I'm going to call it right here. And as more use cases arise where we need it, we'll think about other places to put it. So let's save that. And now we're going to override it, make it a virtual void, the client RPC, and override it on your player network manager. Why are we doing that? Well, if the player has a bow loaded, when we go to cancel, we need to make sure the bow is playing its fire or release animation. So we can do that by checking, do we have an arrow notched? And if we do, we're just going to yoink this code where we have the bow animator firing it. And we're going to paste that right here. All right, cool. Now, right below that, we're going to say if player.isOwner, we can change has arrow notched to false. And we can obviously put that inside the if has arrow notched code, and that will be fine. Copy that in here, paste. All right, let's test that real fast. Save. And I'm going to make the client RPC call up here, otherwise Unity's going to get mad. Go into the game here now. And if I try to roll out of it, so I can walk around all fine, and the roll cancels it. Cool. So I'm actually playing the sound effect. I know you guys can't hear that, but I can. I'm going to get rid of that real fast. I only want to play the release sound effect if the arrow is actually shooting. This is just more like a cancel. So those look good though. Cool. Excellent. I'm going to comment out the sound effect now right here. If you want to keep it, that's cool. I just don't like it. I'm going to delete it entirely actually because I'm definitely never going to bring it back. All right, now we are able to walk around the aim stance, and then we freeze our movement, we fire the projectile, and we freeze our movement, we load the projectile, and we can roll out of it, working as intended. Back to the release arrow projectile, or release arrow functionality rather. We're going to make a new local variable for range projectile item, the projectile we are firing. So we need to know if we're firing from slot 1 or 2. Otherwise, you can do some weird manipulation, as I've learned from people in Nephilim. Thank you, bug testers. So let's make a public projectile slot, current projectile being used. And we're going to set this when we go to our fire projectile action. If you pass all the checks, we're going to say player performing action player combat manager dot current projectile being used equals projectile slot. Because keep in mind, remember these are always in slot 1 or 2. It's going to be right bumper or right trigger. So now we're passing which one we can fire. All right, now back over here, after we've established that we have a way to set our slot, we're going to do a switch statement and switch the slot, and depending on which one we're using, we're going to get our projectile variable that way. So projectile item, if it's on the main slot, equals player.player inventory.main projectile. Likewise, if it is on the secondary slot, we're going to get that from the secondary projectile. Cool, what's next? So we have to make a few variables here now, and then we have to make a new script. So we're going to first check to see if the item is null, simply return. And we already checked the item count before, but just to be safe, we're going to check the item count too. If it is 0, we're going to simply return. So less than or equal to 0, return. All right, now what do we need? We need a transform for the arrow instantiation location or projectile instantiation location. And we also need a game object for the live arrow or live projectile game object. And we need a damage collider, which doesn't exist yet. And we also need a rigid body. We're going to call that live projectile rigid body. Now, let's go make that damage collider. Create C# script, ranged projectile damage collider. And this is under assets, scripts, colliders, if you're following my organization methods. And we're going to also call that variable here now locally too before we go and make that script. So ranged projectile damage collider, projectile damage collider. And I'm just going to change this from live projectile to projectile, just keep with the naming conventions we have here. There we go. Save that. Jump over to the range projectile damage collider script. Now, we're going to not include a lot of this in this video because we're going to get to the polish elements in the next video, if not the one after. So let's keep this very basic. Delete the start and update functionality, dropping your namespace, make it derived from damage collider. Make a variable for character shooting the projectile, which is very important. Make a header for the collision. This is going to be like the rigid body, and in the future we're going to do some stuff with the collider as well, but for now just the rigid body. Private bool has collided is equal false. This isn't going to be used in this video either, but we're going to include it right now just because. So on collision enter, we're going to say if we haven't collided, has collided equals true. Again, that won't be, this is going to be used for penetration and actually instantiating an arrow into whatever it's struck, but we're not going to worry about that for now. Character manager, this is going to be the potential target is equal to collision dot transform dot game object get component character manager. Cool. And then we're going to do a to do check for a shield object, and if it strikes a shield object, perform a block. Check for instantiate a particle, an impact particle, and perform the arrow penetration, so 6 into a surface or a character. And then if the potential target does not equal null, we're going to first check here if the character shooting projectiles equal null, return. This is just temporary again. We're going to actually expand upon this further, but just for the sake to make sure this works and we're actually able to strike a character, if the person shooting the projectile is null, we're going to return. Now, if the world utility manager instance, can I damage this character? We're going to pass the character shooting projectile and the potential target's character group. And if we can damage this character, I'm going to make this even easier. If the potential target is equal null, we're also going to return. And if we can damage this character, we're going to simply pass damage target. And then we're going to pass the potential target as the person being damaged. And remember, since this is a object that inherits logic from damage collider, this is where we're getting damage target. We're going to edit the way damage target and block target works a little bit in the future for projectiles, range projectiles. But for now, this is good. We can make sure it works. And then temporarily until we get future logic, just destroy the arrow. All right, save it. Let's also make a public rigid body here in case you want to reference it from other places. And then on override awake, we're going to say rigid body is equal to get component rigid body. If you don't want to see the variable in the inspector too, you can also hide that in inspector because we're getting on awake. Unless you plan to drag it yourself, you don't want to get on awake. Now, fixed update, we're going to give the arrow some drop. If the rigid body.velocity does not equal vector 3.0, what we're going to do is say rigid body.velocity or rigid body.rotation is equal to quaternion.lookRotation rigid body.velocity. This gives an arrow the nice natural dip that you see. If you ever played Nephilim and shoot the arrow, you can see that it kind of goes down over time. That's that nice dipping effect. If you want to test out how the archery will be, by the way, when we're all done and finalized with it, I have a demo on Steam. You can go try it out. It's going to be pretty much identical to that, except for how we aim. We're going to be doing aiming in first person. Now, if we're not the owner, return. This is before we're checking for the range projectile item, because anything beyond this point is going to be done by the owner only. So if we're not the owner, return. We're going to say projectile item.current ammo amount minus equals 1, so subtract your ammo. to do, make the arrow count update in the UI. We don't even have an arrow count in the UI yet, but we'll do that too in the future. Now, the projectile instantiation location is going to be on the lock on transform.position, just for simplicity's sake. You can put it in the hand if you want. I'm going to keep it there because I want it to come from the center of the character. I found with networking it works a little bit nicer. I'll explain why in a future video. At least it did in Nephilim. Not a big deal if you want to put it in the hand. That's all well and good too. Projectile game object equals instantiate projectile item, released projectile model. We're going to instantiate that at the instantiation location. Next, we're going to say projectile rigid body is equal to. Now, you could get the rigid body from the damage collider, so we could get that first. So we're going to say projectile damage collider is equal to projectile game object.get component. Then we're going to do range projectile damage collider, and then you could get it from there if you dragged in the inspector. So you could say projectile damage collider, or sorry, projectile rigid body is equal to projectile damage collider dot rigid body, yada yada yada. But I'm just going to simply get it off of the game object by saying projectile game object dot get component rigid body. Okay, after we have all of that done, just kind of scanning through this here now, what we want to do next is actually apply some form of damage also to the arrow. Now, I am not going to make a formula in this video, so we're just going to give it a default damage for now. We can come up with a formula for later. I encourage you to do that on your own though, because it's a very fun part of the process, and that will be different depending on how you want to balance your game. So for now, just a flat 100 damage, or you can assign it the damage of the projectile itself. I will come back to this later on, and we're going to do it that way. But we're going to take into account scaling and all that stuff too, in your bow. But for now, this is fine. Let's just make sure it works. So next, fire an arrow based on one of three variations. Yep, there's three. There's if you're locked onto a target, there's if you're unlocked and you're not aiming, and then is if you're aiming. These are all different, and they all need different logic, need to fire a different way. So just for this video right now, we're going to do the locked on target. We'll worry about the other two in the next video. So if the current target does not equal null, we're simply going to modify the rotation of the arrow to make it face the target. This one's the simplest one. I mean, to be fair, they're not all difficult. They just need their own logic, which, you know, that seems to pile up rather quickly and can look intimidating if you do all three at once. So let's just handle this one for now. Quaternion arrow rotation is equal to quaternion look rotation. We're going to take the location of your current target lock-on transform.position. Make sure you reference their lock-on transform so it's in the center of the character and not their default transform, which will be at its feet. We're going to subtract that from the projectile game object.transform.position. Then we're going to say projectile game object.transform.rotation is equal to arrow rotation. That's it. So next, we're going to get all of our character colliders, and we're going to make the arrow ignore them. Now, you might not need this, you probably won't, but just in case your arrow is overlapping with your character and the damage collider, I like doing this because there has been cases where I've used massive arrows in the future, and they kind of touch or tag the person firing it, their collider, for just a moment, and you want it to ignore and not collide on yourself. So character colliders is equal to player.get components in children collider. List colliders is equal to arrows will ignore, and we're going to say this is a new list, and then we're just going to take every collider we got from getting the ones in our character model, and we're going to make this arrow ignore every single one of them by saying colliders arrow will ignore dot add item, and then we go through each of these and we just use that physics.ignore collision function I spoke about in a previous video, which is very handy for stuff like this. We can say for every collider hitbox in, we're going to say character colliders, or rather colliders arrows will ignore. We're going to say physics dot ignore collision hitbox, or rather damage collider dot damage collider, and then the hitbox. So this just gets the damage collider from your arrow and makes sure it ignores every single hitbox on your own character. Set that to true. All right, cool. Then right at the bottom here, rigid body. Whoops, we're going to say projectile rigid body dot add force. And then we're going to say projectile item, or projectile game object dot transform dot forward times projectile item, I think we call it forward velocity. There we go, yeah, forward velocity. Okay, cool. And then right below that, we're going to say projectile game object dot transform dot parent is equal to null, so we unparent it from our lock-on transform. And the last thing we do is sync the arrow on the server RPC and the network, but we're going to do that in the next video. So this won't work on the network by the end of this video, at least not the way it should at all, or at all for that matter. But we're going to do that in the next video. It's going to be pretty straightforward. So let's make our arrow live model by taking the warm-up model and just putting the arrow in and resetting its transform. You want it so the forward direction is facing the same forward direction here, just like this. No manipulation happening here at all, okay? So then add a ranged projectile damage collider script to this, add a rigid body to this, and then add a capsule collider to this. Now I'm going to make the rigid body freeze rotation on X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to make the capsule collider 0.02 radius. I'm going to turn the gizmo so I can see that, make it go to the Z axis for its direction, and I'm going to set the height to something I want. So say 0.9 maybe, that looks good. Alright, it's not a trigger by the way, because we're using on contact or on collision enter. Add a new layer and call this ranged projectile, or just projectile, honestly, if you want, that's fine too. And then go to the layer, assign that new layer, no, just this object, and then drag that in as a new prefab. Drag it into the standard arrow as the release projectile model. There we go. Alright, now I'm going to drag in my damage collider on this, and now I'm going to set the projectile damage collider dot character shooting projectile to the player because I forgot to. This is under the fire projectile function. Save that. I'm going to go to the collision matrix project settings, and I'm going to make sure the ranged projectile only collides with default or another projectile or damageable character. That's it. That's all I want it to collide with. And now I'm going to make it continuous for collision detection in case it's going very, very fast. You don't really need to do that all the time. Oh, and comment this out. Comment out has collided. If that's on, you're not going to get your target. That's my bad. We're not using that yet. Save that. And now if I go into game and load the arrow, aim at the sky, and release, boom, yes, it hits him. You can see the blood effects are popping up right there. Oh, the arrow is popping up in the center of the map. Why is that happening? Am I not putting it in the location? Yeah, okay, so I didn't use my project instantiation location, so that's my bad. Make sure you instantiate it at the project instantiation location. Save that, go back into the scene here. And now we can go back, lock on, and yes, this is working. Now, the reason the blood's popping up there is because we're not finished our damage logic. It doesn't know where to assign the hit because we haven't told it where to. But this is looking good. You can see there, boom, it's going into the target nicely, and it is working. So in the next video, we're going to sync that status across the network, and we're also going to add the functionality for aiming a bow, first person, and for free aiming it. Now, with free aiming it, it's going to basically decide where the arrow is going depending on which direction you're looking in game. And normally this would be accompanied by your model looking up or down because of the manipulation of the rotation of the spine. But we're going to hold off on that bit for now, but we're still going to implement the logic as if you were looking in any direction. Or alternatively, we could just make it so the arrow always fires in the direction you're looking, and then we can make it so it fires up or down if you're looking up or down whenever we add that manipulation. At any rate, thank you very much for being here, guys. I hope you all have a very lovely weekend. Special thank you to my patrons. As always, you have my sincerest gratitude. If you're looking for something to watch, I released a new devlog last night. You can check that out if you want on my second channel. That will be it for me today, guys. I will see you in the next one.